From the outside, our life looked perfect. Olivia and I were the couple people envied. The kind that always had an inside joke to share, held hands in public, and never missed an anniversary. She was fiercely loyal, passionate about everything she did, and had this way of lighting up a room with her laughter. But there was another side to her, a possessive streak that grew sharper with time. Her jealousy wasn't always this intense. In the beginning, it was almost flattering. She would jokingly pout when a waitress smiled at me or tease me about the women I worked with. It felt like a quirk, harmless and even endearing. But as my career took off, it became something else entirely. I worked in the advertising industry, a world full of beautiful people, models, actors, influencers. It wasn't uncommon for me to get texts at odd hours or attend late-night meetings. Olivia always claimed to understand, but I could see the tension building behind her forced smiles. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, Olivia stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed. "Another late night?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah, we're finalizing the campaign," I replied, buttoning my shirt. "It's crunch time." She nodded but didn't say anything. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a look that I couldn't quite place. "Liv," I said, walking over to her, "you know you're the only one for me, right?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know. I just hate sharing you with everyone else." I kissed her forehead, hoping it would ease her mind. "You're not sharing me. This is just work. Once this campaign is done, we'll have all the time in the world." She nodded again, but her silence lingered like a shadow. Things came to a head a few weeks later. I just finished a long day at work and was unwinding on the couch when Olivia stormed into the room, holding my phone in her hand. "Who is Jade?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. I blinked, confused. "Jade? She's one of the models on the campaign. Why?" She shoved the phone at me, and there it was, a text from Jade that read, "Good morning. Can't wait for today's shoot. Here's the final image for approval." Below the text was a photo of Jade in the campaign outfit, looking every bit the professional model she was. "Explain this," Olivia said, her voice icy. I sighed, realizing where this was going. "Liv, this is work. She's one of the models. That's the photo we're using for the ad. There's nothing more to it." Her eyes narrowed. "Good morning? Can't wait for today? That doesn't sound like just work to me, Ryan." "It is just work," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "She's being polite. That's all." But Olivia wasn't having it. She paced the room, her hands clenched into fists. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't see what's happening? You're surrounded by women like her all the time. How am I supposed to believe you're not?" "Because I love you," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Because I've never given you a reason not to trust me." Her laughter was sharp, bitter. "Maybe not before, but this looks like a reason." That night, Olivia barely spoke to me. She sat at the edge of the bed, her back to me, lost in her own thoughts. I tried to bridge the gap, to explain, to reassure her, but every word felt like a drop in a bucket that would never fill. By the time I fell asleep, I felt the distance between us growing, a chasm I didn't know how to cross. I didn't know it then, but that text, innocuous and professional, would become the catalyst for something I never saw coming, something that would shatter the illusion of the life we thought we had. Olivia's silence after the confrontation about Jade was heavier than words. It followed me around the house, coiling tighter with every step. She hadn't said much after that night, but her body language screamed louder than any argument. The cold glances, the way she turned her shoulder when I reached for her, even her forced smiles when we sat down for dinner. All of it was like a slow-burning fuse. I thought it would blow over. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, a bump in the road. After all, we'd faced arguments before, and we always found our way back. But this time felt different. This time, she was holding on to her anger like a lifeline, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't pull her back. I started noticing little changes in her behavior. She'd always been protective of her phone, but now it never left her side. If it buzzed, she'd glance at the screen and tilt it away, her lips curling into a tight line. She began staying late at work more often, something she'd rarely done before. When I asked about it, she'd shrug and mutter something about deadlines, her tone clipped and dismissive. Deadlines? I asked one evening, trying to mask my concern. You've never been one to bring work home, Liv. People change, she replied without looking up from her laptop. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I tried to bridge the gap again. Liv, we need to talk, I said gently, setting down my fork. She looked up, her expression unreadable. About what? About us, I said, leaning forward. I feel like you're pulling away from me, and I don't know how to fix it. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Maybe because I don't want it fixed. Her words hit me like a slap. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm tired, Ryan. I'm tired of feeling like I'm second place to your job, your coworkers, your Jade. Liv, I've told you, there's nothing between me and Jade, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. It was a text, a work-related text. You don't get it, do you? She snapped, her voice rising. It's not about the text. It's about the fact that I don't feel like I matter to you anymore. I don't feel like we matter. Her words left me stunned. I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already pushing back her chair and leaving the table. The next morning, she seemed calmer, but her calmness felt like a mask. She kissed me goodbye before heading to work, a rare moment of softness that I clung to. But that evening, when I came home, I found her sitting on the couch with Sophie, her best friend. The two of them were deep in conversation, their heads close together. They stopped talking when I walked in. Sophie gave me a tight smile, but Olivia didn't even look up. Hey, I said cautiously. What's going on? Nothing, Olivia replied, her tone flat. Just catching up? I nodded, unsure of how to navigate the tension in the room. Sophie excused herself shortly after, leaving me and Olivia alone. Are you okay? I asked, sitting beside her. I'm fine, she said, her voice distant. Just tired. I wanted to press her, to ask what she and Sophie had been talking about, but I didn't. Something about the way she looked at me, like I was already miles away, stopped me. Over the next few weeks, her behavior grew stranger. She started dressing differently, sleeker, more polished, whenever she left for work. She laughed more when she was on her phone, but clammed up the moment I walked into the room. I told myself it was nothing, that she was still upset about the text and needed time. But deep down, a part of me knew something was wrong. One night, as I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, I realized how far apart we'd grown. The Olivia I knew, the woman who once couldn't go a day without teasing me, who always pulled me into her arms when I was stressed, felt like a memory. I wanted to believe we could find our way back to each other. I wanted to believe this was just a phase, a bump in the road. But as the days passed, that belief began to crack, piece by piece. And I didn't know how to stop it. I thought Olivia and I were starting to mend things, that the storm brewing between us would blow over. I wanted to believe that the silence between us was temporary, that she just needed time to trust me again. But trust wasn't her goal. Revenge was. It started with small things, so subtle that I almost missed them. She began leaving earlier for work, sometimes before I was even awake. Her goodnight kisses became pecks in the air, her warm touch replaced by an icy distance. I told myself it was just stress or lingering resentment over the argument about Jade's text. But Olivia wasn't just distant. She was scheming. I came home one evening to find her laughing on the phone, her voice light and carefree in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she quickly hung up, her smile fading like a shadow under sunlight. Who was that? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Just Sophie, she replied, too quickly. Her answer didn't sit right with me, but I didn't press her. Something about the way she avoided my gaze told me I wouldn't get the truth even if I did. A few days later, I overheard snippets of a conversation between Olivia and Sophie. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. It was just one of those moments when their hushed voices carried through the thin walls of the house. He doesn't suspect a thing, Olivia said, her tone almost gleeful. Sophie's response was muffled, but her laughter rang loud and clear. I froze, my stomach knotting. What didn't I suspect? What were they talking about? I wanted to burst into the room, demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was denial. Instead, I walked away, my mind racing with possibilities. Over the next week, Olivia's behavior grew more suspicious. She started staying late at work, coming home hours after dinner, smelling faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't hers. When I asked about it, she brushed me off with vague excuses about last-minute meetings and team brainstorming sessions. The pieces began to fall into place when I saw her texting late at night, her phone tilted away from me as she smiled at the screen. I didn't recognize the number, but the way her cheeks flushed told me everything I needed to know. My suspicions were confirmed when I found a receipt tucked into the back pocket of her jeans while doing laundry. It was from an upscale restaurant I'd never been to, a place we used to talk about visiting together but never had. The receipt wasn't for 2 people. It was for 3. By this point, my denial had faded, replaced by a sinking realization. Olivia wasn't just upset about Jade's text. She was punishing me for it. And she was using Derek, her boss, and Liam, her coworker, to do it. I'd met Derek once at a company function. He was slick, all charm and confidence, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd been overly friendly with Olivia, brushing his hand against hers when he thought I wasn't looking, complimenting her in ways that felt too personal. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, chalking it up to his personality. Now, it made sense. Liam was another story. He was younger, inexperienced, and openly infatuated with Olivia. I'd seen the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the room. He was the perfect pawn in her game, eager to do whatever she asked. One night, I finally confronted her. "Who were you with last Friday?" I asked as she walked through the door, setting her bag down on the counter. She froze for a moment before turning to me, her expression carefully neutral. "What are you talking about?" "That receipt," I said, pulling it from my pocket and holding it up. "The one from that restaurant. The one for 3 people." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold defiance. "Why does it matter?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You're the one who started this, Ryan. You're the one who let women like Jade into your life." "Jade is a coworker," I said through clenched teeth. "That's it. And so are Derek and Liam," she shot back. "But maybe they're a little more than that now." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I stared at her, trying to understand how we'd gotten here, how the woman I'd once loved so deeply could look at me with such venom. "You're trying to hurt me," I said finally, my voice steady. She smirked, a cruel edge to her smile. "Maybe I am. Maybe you deserve it." And with that, she walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of her words. That night, I realized that the woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. But if she thought I would crumble under the weight of her revenge, she was wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time Olivia's intentions became clear, I wasn't just hurt, I was determined. Her confession about Derek and Liam wasn't meant to spark a discussion or lead to an apology. It was a declaration, an attempt to break me. But instead of crumbling, I found myself sharpening, piece by piece. I needed answers. The woman I loved had turned into someone I barely recognized, and I had to know why. It started with her phone. She'd always kept it close, but lately, she treated it like a lifeline. I wasn't proud of what I did, but when she left it unattended one night while showering, I couldn't resist. I unlocked it with the passcode I'd memorized months ago, my heart pounding as I scrolled through her messages. The conversation with Derek confirmed my worst fears. The texts were flirtatious at first, full of compliments and subtle innuendos. Then they became explicit, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Derek, you looked stunning today. I can't stop thinking about you." "Olivia, stop or I'll blush." "But I liked last night. When can we do it again?" I felt sick reading the words, but I forced myself to keep going. The exchange with Liam was no better. He was more desperate, his messages dripping with infatuation. "Liam, you're amazing, Liv. I don't care about Ryan. I'll treat you better." "Olivia, you're sweet." Maybe I'll let you try again soon. Again. The word hit me like a slap. This wasn't just flirting. It was a pattern, a deliberate choice to betray me. I sat there for what felt like hours, the phone heavy in my hands. When Olivia finally came out of the shower, I was back in the living room, pretending to read an email. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual. "Yeah," I replied, not looking up. "Just work." But inside, I was anything but calm. The next step was Derek. I'd met him a few times at her office events, and he always struck me as the charming type, the kind who thrived on attention and used it to get what he wanted. I decided to dig deeper. Through a friend in corporate HR, I learned Derek wasn't exactly the golden boy he pretended to be. He'd been transferred twice within the company after misconduct allegations that had been quietly settled. He was known for blurring the lines between professionalism and personal relationships, and Olivia wasn't the first woman he'd charmed. But what about Liam? He was younger, greener, someone who seemed harmless on the surface. I reached out to Marcus, my closest confidant, who worked in a similar industry. Marcus had a knack for digging into people's digital lives, and with a little effort, he unearthed Liam's online trail. Turns out Liam wasn't just Olivia's coworker. He'd been obsessed with her for years. Old social media posts revealed cryptic captions about unrequited love and finally having a chance. He wasn't a coworker with a crush. He was a man who had fixated on her long before any of this began. The final puzzle piece came from Olivia herself. Her diary, tucked away in the back of her closet, held entries that painted a picture of her descent into revenge. Ryan's world is so perfect. His job, his coworkers, his charm. It's like he has everything. Meanwhile, I'm just here, watching him thrive while I fade into the background. I can't believe he's still denying the text. I know there's more to it. Fine. If he wants to play games, so can I. The entries revealed not just jealousy but insecurity, an inferiority complex that had festered over time. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted to feel in control, to feel like she mattered. Armed with the truth, I felt the weight of my heartbreak transform into something sharper. Olivia thought she'd taken control, but she'd underestimated me. That night, as I stared at her sleeping form, I knew I couldn't let her win. If she wanted to play games, I'd show her what real strategy looked like. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity and showing her the cost of her choices. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready. I couldn't stop replaying her words in my mind. I slept with my boss and my coworker, and I don't regret it. She had said it with such defiance, as though her actions were justified, as though she wanted me to feel small, broken. But instead of shattering me, her confession lit a fire I hadn't felt before, a fire to take control of the narrative. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I smirked. I met her gaze, as steady as I could manage, and delivered my response. I only fight for things with value, not trash. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and deliberate. For the first time, her mask cracked. Her confidence wavered. Olivia wasn't expecting calm. She wanted chaos, tears, anything to validate her twisted revenge. But I gave her nothing. The silence after my words was deafening. Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to respond. I stood, pushing my chair back slowly. "I'm done with dinner," I said, my tone cold and detached. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." I left her there at the table, staring after me, her pride flickering like a candle in the wind. In the quiet of our bedroom, I felt the weight of what had just happened settle over me. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I had loved fiercely, had not only betrayed me but done so deliberately. She wanted me to suffer, to feel what she assumed I had made her feel. But she didn't understand me at all. The next morning, Olivia acted like nothing had happened. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, making coffee and scrolling through her phone. When I walked in, she glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. "Morning," she said casually. I poured myself a cup of coffee, ignoring her attempt at normalcy. "Morning." She hesitated, then added, "So, are we going to talk about last night?" I leaned against the counter, taking a sip of my coffee before answering. "No, there's nothing left to talk about." Her jaw tightened. But she didn't push. Instead, she grabbed her bag and left for work without another word. Over the next few days, I watched Olivia carefully. She carried herself like someone who had won, her confidence radiating in subtle ways. The way she smiled at her phone, the way she hummed while getting ready. She thought her confession had broken me. She thought her revenge was complete. But she didn't know what I had discovered. I knew about Derek and Liam. I knew about her motivations, her insecurities, the reasons she'd convinced herself that this betrayal was justified. And while she walked through life thinking she held all the cards, I was quietly gathering my own. One evening, while Olivia was out with her friends, I invited Marcus over. He'd been my sounding board through this whole mess, and I needed his perspective on my next move. She admitted it? Marcus asked, disbelief written all over his face. Every detail, I said, leaning back in my chair. Derek, Liam. She didn't even flinch when she said it. Marcus shook his head. Man, I don't know how you didn't lose it right there. Because losing it is what she wanted, I replied. She wanted me to crumble, to beg. But that's not who I am. Marcus nodded, his respect clear. So, what's the plan? I glanced at the stack of papers on the table, printouts of her text messages, photos of her outings, the receipts I'd found. The plan is to let her think she's won. And then, when she least expects it, I'll remind her who I am. When Olivia returned home that night, she was all smiles, her laughter filling the room as she recounted some jokes Sophie had made. I played my part, nodding and chuckling in all the right places, letting her believe that I was oblivious to the truth. But inside, I was steeling myself for what was to come. Olivia thought her confession was the final blow, the end of the battle. But she was wrong. This was just the beginning. After Olivia's bold confession, our house felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and filled with an unspoken tension that seemed to hang over every interaction. She had expected me to explode, to demand answers, to beg for her love. Instead, I had smirked and walked away, leaving her sitting there, stunned. I think she mistook my composure for indifference. She went about her days with an air of confidence, as though her revelation had shifted the balance of power in her favor. She laughed louder, spent more time on her phone, and dressed like she was heading to a runway, even for mundane errands. But behind her bravado, I saw cracks beginning to form. The first sign came a few days later. Olivia's boss, Derek, sent her an abrupt email about restructuring at the office. It wasn't an outright dismissal, but it was clear her position was being reevaluated. I overheard her pacing the living room that evening, her voice sharp and anxious as she spoke to Sophie. "They're sidelining me," she said. "Derek's barely looking at me in meetings, and now this email? It doesn't make sense." "Maybe he's just under pressure," Sophie offered weakly. But Olivia wasn't convinced. I listened from the next room, sipping my coffee, knowing exactly what was happening. Derek was trying to distance himself from her, afraid that their affair might backfire on him. I didn't feel sorry for her, not even a little. Liam, her coworker, was next to falter. For weeks, Olivia had treated him like a pawn, someone to stroke her ego and fill the gaps in her life she believed I couldn't. But Liam was young, impulsive, and hopelessly infatuated. He began texting her obsessively, his messages growing more desperate by the day. "Why haven't you replied? Are you mad at me? I thought we had something special, Liv. Please don't ignore me. If you don't want me, just say it. I can't keep doing this." I could see the frustration on her face as she scrolled through his texts, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before tossing her phone aside with a sigh. Liam wasn't part of her plan anymore. He was a loose end, and loose ends were inconvenient. At home, Olivia and I settled into a cold war. We spoke only when necessary, exchanging polite words over breakfast or discussing errands in clipped tones. The warmth that once filled our conversations was gone, replaced by something brittle and strained. But she was still watching me, studying my every move. I could feel her eyes on me when I worked late in the study or when I stepped out for a coffee with Marcus. She was looking for signs of anger, of revenge, of anything that showed I hadn't forgiven her. What she didn't realize was that forgiveness wasn't even on the table. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, Olivia walked in, her arms crossed and her expression tense. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I set my book down and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated before speaking. "I know things haven't been great between us lately." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her fill the silence. I feel like we're drifting further apart," she continued, her tone uncertain. "And I don't want that." Her words were almost laughable. She didn't want us to drift apart, but she had confessed to sleeping with her boss and coworker without a shred of regret. The hypocrisy was staggering. "Olivia," I said evenly, "you made your choices. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it anyway. So forgive me if I don't feel like fixing something you went out of your way to destroy." She flinched, her confidence wavering. "I was hurt, Ryan. I thought you were cheating on me." "That text was about work," I interrupted. "And you knew that. You just didn't want to believe it because it didn't fit the story you wanted to tell yourself." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "No, Olivia," I said, standing. "A mistake is something you do once. What you did was deliberate." She sat there, silent and stunned, as I walked away. The fallout had only just begun. Olivia's world was starting to unravel, and she had no one to blame but herself. She thought she could use her confession as a weapon to hurt me, but all she had done was expose the cracks in her own foundation. And as those cracks widened, I was ready to watch it all come crashing down. The silence in our house had become deafening. Olivia was walking on eggshells, unsure of where we stood after our last conversation. She still carried herself with a defiant air, but it was clear that my reaction, or lack of one, had unsettled her. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. Instead, I carried on with my life as though her confession had merely been a passing breeze. But beneath my calm exterior, I was preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It wasn't just about what she had done. It was about making her understand the gravity of her choices and ensuring she couldn't twist the narrative to make herself the victim. One evening, I came home from work to find her waiting for me in the living room. She was dressed impeccably, as if trying to remind me of the woman I'd fallen in love with. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Ryan," she began, her voice steady but soft. "We need to talk." I set my bag down and leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms. "All right, talk." She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I know I hurt you. I know what I did was wrong." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her continue. "I was angry, okay? I was jealous. I thought you were cheating on me, and I let that consume me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I wanted to hurt you the way I thought you hurt me." "And?" I prompted, my tone calm but firm. She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. And I realized now that I was wrong. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I should have trusted you. Her words might have moved me once, but not anymore. I could see the cracks in her facade, the desperation behind her apology. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry for the fallout it caused. I sat down across from her, my gaze steady. "Olivia, do you even understand the damage you've done?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "You accused me of cheating over a text message, an innocent, professional text message. You didn't even give me the benefit of the doubt. Instead, you decided to retaliate by sleeping with your boss and coworker." She flinched, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just betray me, Olivia. You betrayed our marriage, our trust, everything we built together. And for what? To prove a point?" "I thought you didn't care about us anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Did I give you a reason to think that?" I demanded. "Did I ever treat you like you didn't matter? Or was that just something you told yourself to justify what you wanted to do?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. I stood, pacing the room as I spoke. "The worst part is, I could have forgiven you for feeling insecure. I could have worked with you to rebuild trust if you just come to me. But you didn't. You went behind my back, and now you expect me to pick up the pieces?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but I don't want to lose you." I turned to face her, my expression hard. You already lost me, Olivia. The moment you decided our marriage wasn't worth fighting for, you lost me. Her sobs filled the room, but I felt no sympathy. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability. Not the carefully crafted mask of regret she wore, but the raw fear of losing control. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of consequences, and it terrified her. You made your choices, I said, my voice cold. And now, you have to live with them. Her tears continued, but I didn't let them sway me. This wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming my dignity. That night, I slept in the guest room. The distance between us had never felt more tangible. I wasn't sure what would come next, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let her actions define me. Olivia had tried to burn everything down in her quest for revenge, but I wasn't the one left standing in the ashes. She was, and she had no one to blame but herself. I knew Olivia wasn't done. The apology, the tears, the promises, they weren't enough to mend what she had broken, and deep down, I suspected she knew that. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't done either. I had been calm, calculated, and deliberate in my reactions up until now, but there was more to be said and done. She wanted control, to frame herself as the wounded party. She wanted to manipulate the narrative, to make me the villain in her story. But she underestimated me. So, I planned my move carefully. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. It was about stripping away her excuses and forcing her to face the reality of her actions. The opportunity came unexpectedly one Friday evening. Olivia mentioned she'd invited Sophie and a few friends over for drinks. Normally, I'd excuse myself from these gatherings, but this time, I stayed. I watched her laugh with Sophie, her voice a little too loud, her gestures a little too exaggerated. She was performing, trying to show everyone that she was in control, that everything was fine. But it wasn't. Halfway through the evening, I made my move. Standing at the edge of the living room, I cleared my throat, silencing the chatter. Olivia, I said, my tone calm but firm, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Her smile faltered, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and unease. Ryan, this isn't the time. It is, I interrupted, stepping forward. You've been avoiding this for weeks, and I think it's time your friends heard the truth too. The room fell silent, all eyes on us. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us as if trying to decide whether to intervene. What are you talking about? Olivia asked, her voice trembling slightly. I took a deep breath, keeping my composure. I'm talking about your confession, about what you did with Derek and Liam. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sophie's eyes widened, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Olivia froze, her face draining of color. Ryan, stop, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I said, my voice growing steadier. You wanted to hurt me, Olivia. You wanted to make me feel small, insignificant. And for what? Because you saw a text message and jumped to conclusions? She opened her mouth to respond, but I pressed on. You never even gave me a chance to explain. You made up your mind, and then you acted on it. You betrayed me, you betrayed our marriage, and now you're sitting here pretending like none of it happened. Her friends stared at her, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. Sophie looked like she wanted to crawl under the couch. I made a mistake, Olivia said finally, her voice cracking. No, Olivia, I replied, my tone sharp. A mistake is an accident. What you did was deliberate. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it. The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia's bravado was gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow look. For the first time, I saw the full weight of her actions settle over her. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. But it did, I said, stepping back. And now, there's no going back. The room remained awkwardly silent as I turned and walked away, leaving Olivia to face the judgment of her friends. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. When I reached the bedroom, I closed the door behind me and let out a shaky breath. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. Olivia had spent weeks trying to control the narrative, to frame herself as the victim, but now the truth was out. I wasn't looking for pity or applause. I wasn't even looking for closure from her. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, reclaiming my dignity, my peace, and my sense of self. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest felt lighter. Olivia had made her choices, and I had finally made mine. Whatever came next, I knew I'd be ready. Because I wasn't the same man who had begged her to trust me all those weeks ago. I was stronger, and I was finally free. The fallout from my confrontation with Olivia rippled through our lives like an earthquake. The house felt quieter than ever, but it wasn't the calm of resolution. It was the silence of a battleground, the eerie stillness after the last cannon had fired. Olivia's friends, especially Sophie, avoided me after that night. I wasn't surprised. Sophie had always been Olivia's loyal echo, her biggest cheerleader in every argument. But now, even she couldn't ignore what Olivia had done. The looks on their faces as they processed my words were etched in my mind. Shock, discomfort, judgment. They saw her for what she had become, and Olivia hated it. For the next few days, Olivia moved through the house like a ghost, her confidence shattered. She didn't say much, but I could feel her watching me, trying to gauge my mood, to see if there was still any chance of salvaging what was left. She tried to reach out in small ways. A cup of coffee left on the counter for me, a soft, good night, as she passed my room. But I didn't engage. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I didn't know how to respond. How do you speak to someone who's destroyed the very foundation of your relationship? Meanwhile, the cracks in Olivia's carefully constructed world continued to widen. Derek, her boss, had completely distanced himself. She came home one evening, slamming her bag down on the counter, her face a mix of anger and frustration. "They're transferring me," she said bitterly. "Transferring?" I asked, my tone neutral. "To another department," she replied, pacing the kitchen. "Apparently, it's part of some restructuring, but we both know what this is about." I didn't respond. What could I say? She'd tied herself to Derek, and now she was paying the price. Liam was another story. His obsession with Olivia had reached a breaking point. She began receiving flowers at the office, anonymous notes with messages like, "I'll always be here for you." One night, she found him waiting for her in the parking lot after work. She called me, her voice shaking as she told me what had happened. "He's not dangerous," she said quickly, almost as if trying to convince herself. "He's just emotional." "Emotional?" I asked, my voice cold. "That's what happens when you play with someone's feelings, Olivia." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The distance between us grew wider with every passing day. She tried to bridge it once, sitting down across from me at the dining table, her eyes pleading. "Ryan, I know I messed up," she said softly. "I know I hurt you, but I don't want to lose you." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "You already did, Olivia. The moment you decided I wasn't worth trusting, you lost me." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't waver. She needed to hear the truth. "This isn't just about what you did," I continued. "It's about the fact that you didn't even try to fix things. You went straight to revenge, straight to betrayal. And now you want me to pretend like that didn't happen?" She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm sorry, Ryan," she whispered. "I know you are," I said, "but sorry isn't enough." That night, I began packing my things. I hadn't decided where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay. The house was a constant reminder of what we'd lost, of the woman I thought I knew and the man I had to become to survive her betrayal. As I zipped up my suitcase, Olivia stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't go. We can fix this. We can try again." I paused, looking at her for a long moment. "You made your choice, Olivia. Now I'm making mine." Her sobs followed me as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. The fallout wasn't just hers, it was mine too. But as I drove away, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: freedom. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. This chapter of my life was over, and I wasn't going to let it define me. Olivia had tried to burn everything down, but in the ashes, I was finally ready to rebuild. Walking away from Olivia that night wasn't just the hardest thing I've ever done. it was also the most necessary. As I drove away from the house we once shared, the weight of our failed marriage pressed against my chest like a vice. But with every mile I put between us, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. Olivia's tears, her pleas, her regret, they stayed behind in that house. And I wasn't going to carry them with me anymore. I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town, far from the places that held memories of us. It wasn't much, just a clean space with bare walls and simple furniture, but it was mine. I stood in the middle of that empty living room on the first night, letting the silence wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The next few weeks were about rediscovery. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges. My coworkers noticed the change almost immediately. "You're different lately," Marcus said one afternoon as we grabbed lunch. "More focused. Driven." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "I guess I just realized what's important." Marcus smirked. "About time. You've always had it in you. Just needed the right push." It wasn't just work that changed. I started hitting the gym again, something I'd let slip during the chaos of my marriage. The hours spent lifting weights and running on the treadmill became my therapy, a way to channel my frustration and rebuild my confidence. Every drop of sweat felt like a step toward reclaiming the man I used to be, the man Olivia had tried to break. Occasionally, I'd hear about Olivia through mutual acquaintances. She was still at the company, but in a less prominent role. Derek had been quietly moved to another office, his reputation tarnished but not entirely destroyed. Liam, on the other hand, had been let go. Apparently, his obsession with Olivia had spiraled out of control, leading to a confrontation that left the company no choice but to fire him. Part of me wondered if Olivia regretted everything now that her world had crumbled, but I quickly pushed the thought aside. Her regret wasn't my concern anymore. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across our wedding photo. I stared at it for a long time, memories flooding back. The way she'd smiled at me that day, the promises we'd made, the future we thought we'd build together. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. Not for Olivia, but for what we'd lost. I placed the photo back in the box and sealed it shut. That chapter of my life was over, and it didn't belong in my present. In time, I started to open myself up to new possibilities. I met people through work events, at the gym, even at the coffee shop I frequented. One day, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Elena, who worked in a nearby office. Elena was everything Olivia wasn't: kind, grounded, and genuine. She didn't play games or seek validation through drama. Our conversations were easy, our laughter unforced. We started meeting for coffee regularly, then dinner. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something quieter, steadier. One evening, as Elena and I walked through the park, she turned to me with a curious look. "You don't talk much about your past," she said gently. I smiled, looking out at the lake. "Because it's not who I am anymore. I've learned to let it go." She nodded, slipping her hand into mine. "I like who you are now." For the first time in a long time, I believed it. The fallout from my marriage with Olivia had been devastating, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had forced me to grow, to confront the parts of myself I'd ignored for too long. Walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. And as I stood there in the park, with the cool breeze against my face and Elena's hand in mine, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And that, I thought, was the greatest revenge of all.